Why is Africa still poor despite its abundant resources? Africa, a continent rich in natural resources, human resources, rich in history, culture, and a cradle of ancient civilizations, continues to grapple with poverty despite its vast wealth. To understand this paradox, we must delve into the continent's history, economic trajectory, and the long-lasting effects of external interventions. This video aims to explain the complex reasons for Africa's economic struggles, touching on the legacies of colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and post-independence challenges that continue to shape the continent, leading to its present-day poverty state. If you find this content insightful, please subscribe to Borderlink Reporters TV for more in-depth analysis and stories. Flourishing past. Africa in the 14th century was home to powerful kingdoms and empires. East Africa was connected to the Indian Ocean trade routes, while West Africa housed the Mali Empire, ruled by Mansa Musa, the wealthiest man in the world. African civilizations were not isolated. They were as connected to global trade and development as Europe and Asia. The continent had developed advanced metallurgy, medicine, mathematics, architecture, engineering, navigation, and complex political systems. However, this prosperity began to wane in the 15th century due to external pressures from emerging empires. Role of external forces. The decline of Africa's wealth can be traced back to the rise of two significant powers, the Ottoman and Western European empires. The Ottomans needed slaves and sourced them through wars in East Africa. This devastating trade lasted for centuries, draining African communities of human resources. Simultaneously, European traders began exploiting West Africa's resources, initially trading for gold, ivory, and salt. However, the discovery of the Americas created a demand for labor that reshaped the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were captured and sold as slaves, devastating African societies. The shift in African economies towards the export of human labor weakened the continent, as wars were fought to capture slaves, and the region's wealth was drained to feed European and American industries. Economic impact of slave trade. Slave trade here refers to the business or practice of capturing, transporting, selling, and buying enslaved African people for profit. It involved theft, bribery, corruption, and exercising brute force, as well as trickery. Slave trade had profound long-term effects on African economies. Before industrialization, the size of a country's economy was directly linked to its population. With the loss of millions of people, African countries saw their economies shrink, preventing the development of industries that were flourishing in Europe and Asia. Craftspeople who were essential for economic growth were either enslaved or killed, stunting Africa's ability to build a strong industrial base. Moreover, African economies became increasingly dependent on the slave trade. Various African states, including the Ghana and Mali empires, participated in the trade, which initially seemed beneficial as it provided a source of income. However, this reliance on trade led to a shift in focus from goods production to human export, further weakening the continent's economic foundations. Colonization. Abolishing the slave trade paved the way to colonialism. Colonialism is a form of dominance that entails the subjugation of one people to another. When European nations colonize Africa, often they destroy what's already existed and never replace it. By the 19th century, Africa's weakened state made it vulnerable to European colonization. The Industrial Revolution increased the demand for raw materials, and European powers saw Africa as a resource-rich region ripe for exploitation. Colonization led to three major consequences for Africa: deepening poverty, infrastructure for extraction, and loss of governance skills. Deepening poverty. European colonizers extracted vast wealth from Africa while providing little in return. The Congo Free State, for example, saw millions of people who worked to death to extract resources like rubber, whereas King Leopold of Belgium ordered the mutilation of millions of civilians, including children and women. Africans were driven off their fertile lands to make way for European settlers, and tax paid by Africans were rarely invested in their well-being. Infrastructure for extraction. The infrastructure built by European colonizers was designed to extract resources rather than connect African communities. Roads, railways, and ports were constructed to transport raw materials to Europe, leaving African economies fragmented and disconnected. The first president of Togo highlighted this problem, noting that roads rarely connected African economic centers, but instead led to the coast for export. Loss of governance skills. Colonization also stripped African societies of the ability to govern themselves. European colonizers replaced African leaders with Europeans, depriving them of the skills needed to manage their economies and societies. When independence came in the mid-20th century, African countries were left without the knowledge and experience necessary to build functioning states. The West's ruthless economic ties. For more than 800 years, the West's economic relationship with Africa has remained largely unchanged. This fact is astounding, especially considering the rapid developments the West itself has experienced in just a few decades. While nearly everything else has evolved, the exploitative dynamic between the West and Africa has stayed the same for centuries. Historically, this relationship has always been extractive. The West's ruthless exploitation of Africa, which began 800 years ago, continues today. It's clear that maintaining this system of subjugation is of utmost importance to Western powers. No matter how the world shifts, the West appears committed to preserving Africa's subordination. This exploitation has enabled the West to present itself as a superior civilization. Just like a con artist who pretends to be wealthy, the West has built its image of superiority on the back of Africa's resources. Its material success, symbolized by advancements like modern technology and high standards of living, has relied heavily on the systematic pillaging of Africa. Theft, slavery, piracy, and violence form the bedrock of the West's wealth. By extracting both human and natural resources from Africa, the West has been able to maintain an unearned reputation as a beacon of civilization. For the West, keeping Africa suppressed, impoverished, and dependent is not just important, it is very essential. This exploitation allows the West to uphold the illusion of supremacy, which is not grounded in genuine advancement or morality, but in raw power and deceit. Today, the trade imbalance between the West and Africa is clear. About 70% of what the West exports to Africa consists of manufactured goods, while it imports raw materials from Africa. These raw materials are the very resources the West needs to produce the goods that it then sells back to Africa, trapping the continent in a cycle of dependency. Although Africa has the raw materials necessary to produce its own goods, its ability to build a strong manufacturing base has been deliberately hindered. Ideally, Africa would use its own resources to develop industries domestically, rather than exporting raw materials to the West. If Africa took control of its own production, it would have a profound impact on the global economy, potentially undermining the West's economic dominance. The West is fully aware of this reality. Its entire economy, and by extension its civilization, depends on Africa's continued subjugation. For over 800 years, despite changing global dynamics, the West has remained committed to maintaining its exploitative hold over Africa. This relationship is arguably the most crucial element of the West's global strategy. Continued colonial exploitation. One of the primary causes of Africa's continued poverty is colonial exploitation, which began with the scramble for Africa, leading to the Berlin Conference and to what I called pseudo-independence. Colonial false borders mapped the entirety of Africa. They were employed to create nations that are more than just tenable by dividing several tribes. For instance, Nigeria is made up of about 371 ethnic groups that the colonial overlords united into a single nation. In actuality, Africans are devoted to their families, clans, tribes, and religions, with their nation coming in last. This is why, when a tyrant rises to power, they seek to surround themselves with members of their tribe and family. They exclusively trust those people, while distrusting people from other tribes. That is why, in the instance of African exploitation, the origins of the African nation-state are the development of what I refer to as colonial presidents. Colonial presidents are leaders of an African country not chosen nor elected by the people through a democratic process. They are installed by colonial powers such as France, the US, and the UK. Colonial masters play games behind the scenes, putting the president in power. In Africa, especially French colonies, puppet presidents wield infinite authority because they rule by edict. Whatever they desire, it goes, and this is intentional by the colonial monsters of those African countries in order to bring these people into power. This system was designed so that no one can check the president. If the colonial master wants natural resources, such as Cameroon oil, the president can decide unilaterally to sell them without going through Parliament, Senate, or consulting with other stakeholders. They do not seek counsel from other parties. They make decisions on their own and give everything to the colonial masters because they are wonderful slaves. The colonial master at times facilitates or aids the tyrant with opening an offshore account in the islands or Europe. After quitting power or being deposed in a military coup, they can enjoy their plunder calmly abroad. This is how colonial presidents work. These tyrants are like superheroes. They wield excessive power, which is detrimental to Africa's growth, post-independence struggle. With independence came hopes for prosperity, but these hopes were quickly dashed as African nations struggled to build sustainable economies. Many African countries adopted African socialism, a situation where the government controlled industries to drive industrialization. The idea was to replace low-paying agricultural jobs with higher-paying manufacturing jobs to achieve rapid economic growth. However, several factors hindered this approach. Trade barriers. African countries impose high tariffs on foreign goods to protect local industries, but this also made it difficult for them to trade with each other. Without access to large markets, African industries remained small and uncompetitive. Government inefficiency. Centrally planned economies were slow to adapt to changes in global markets. The inefficiencies of large government-controlled industries prevented African economies from keeping pace with the rapid growth of industries in North America, Europe, and East Asia. Lack of education. The lack of an educated workforce further hindered Africa's ability to industrialize. By the 1950s, only a small fraction of Africans had received secondary or university education. This limited the continent's ability to build and manage modern industries. Geographical and environmental challenges. Africa's harsh environment also posed significant challenges. Droughts, locusts, and other natural disasters made agriculture difficult, while diseases like malaria, sleeping sickness, and river blindness devastated populations and hindered economic growth. Corruption and political instability. The source and origin of corruption in Africa is entirely European and foreign imperialism. Corruption became a significant obstacle to development in post-independence Africa. Most African countries were divided along ethnic lines, a legacy of colonialism. Politicians often appealed to specific ethnic groups to gain power, which led to further divisions and instability. Once in power, leaders engaged in corrupt practices, accepting bribes in exchange for access to resources. This system enriched a small elite while leaving the rest of the population impoverished. Foreign companies and governments also played a role in perpetuating corruption. By bribing African leaders, they gained access to valuable resources, often at the expense of the local population. This system created a vicious cycle where corruption led to poverty, and poverty led to more corruption. Democracy and its discontent. The concept of democracy originated in ancient Greece and has been a source of unrest. The term democracy is derived from demokratia, meaning people governing. Demo means people. Kratia implies governing. Democracy should be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. After African countries gained what I call flag independence, the people were overjoyed and believed that for the first time, they would be able to enjoy the kind of self-determination enjoyed by newly independent countries such as the US. What Africa obtained was not true independence. It was like democracy without the guardrails. The rails that ensure that democracy functions smoothly were removed. Just like a railway track, if the rails and guards that hold the rails together are removed, the train will veer off track. And that is why democracy has fallen off track in Africa. That is why most Africans are dissatisfied with democracy. They believe that this style of administration has yielded no dividends for Africa and has failed to develop the continent, as a result of which lots of Africans are fleeing. They are hopeless and in despair, which is why they're traveling to the north of Africa, to Europe, in pursuit of greener pastures. These migrants are making their way on improvised boats to Europe, where they believed El Dorado lay. Sadly, many of them die without making it. Africans are not happy about this, as video evidence shows them frequently traveling across the Mediterranean, proving that democracy as a system of governance is ineffective throughout the continent. My question is, if democracy is effective in the West, why is it failing in Africa? It's because democracy's checkpoints are absent from Africa. Africa's democracy was designed to produce strongmen rulers and not leaders who are above the constitution. Political operators take advantage of the absence of these guardrails. Why are there no guards? The reason is because the majority of these foreign powers and the former colonial powers do not want these guardrails to exist. It will be more difficult for them to corrupt an African leader if the guardrails are present. Western powers wanted things done so they could simply and without difficulty corrupt an African leader at any time, without having to deal with an institution. It would be difficult for one president to decide unilaterally to give Africa's wealth to France, for example, if Africa had robust institutions or a real parliament. There would be debate, and it would take time if France had to go through an African parliament, but naturally there is no debate since democracy in Africa lacks structure. The president makes decisions alone. In Africa, democracy is more akin to a Trojan horse. The Trojan horse is a famous tale from Greek mythology, particularly from the Iliad and Aeneid, where the Greeks used a deceptive wooden horse to infiltrate the city of Troy. After a long siege, the Greeks pretended to retreat, leaving behind a giant wooden horse with Greek soldiers hidden inside. The Trojans, thinking it was a gift of peace, brought the horse inside their city walls. That night, the hidden soldiers emerged, opened the gates for the Greek army, and Troy was finally conquered. The Trojan horse symbolizes clever deception, and unexpected victory. That is how democracy functions in Africa. When the Europeans came to Africa, they were inside the Trojan horse that they gave Africans as a gift. They began robbing the Africans of their possessions. Although democracy is not inherently a negative form of government, you must consider why it works so well in the West and other parts of the world, but so poorly in Africa. Democracy thrives in the West and other parts of the world, but falters in Africa because it lacks the safety nets that keep democracy intact. Consider the US as the ideal illustration. Imagine what would have happened if Donald Trump was an African president. He could have easily stolen the 2020 election he lost. He attempted in the US but failed because Americans uphold the rule of law, making his coup attempt unsuccessful. He failed because America's system is one of checks and balances, which is how a democratic system should be constructed. We've seen situations where African leaders lose elections, refuse to step down, and decide to cling to power because they control the military. However, we cannot construct a democratic system and then grant the president imperial powers, because doing so gives these operators carte blanche to plunder the populace and sell the nation without consequence. The majority of African leaders are selling their countries because they own them. President Biya of Cameroon once declared, "I'm doing it because I can, I'm getting away with it, and that's the truth." These thugs are robbing the people of their resources and getting away with it. They are also getting away with murder. Because of this, they continue to steal from the public, inspiring others to do the same because there are no consequences. Look at China, the US, France, and Russia hosting conferences for African leaders. Due to their ongoing efforts to appropriate Africa's resources, this situation will persist. Even though Britain is a small country, it managed to conquer the world despite its small size. Its citizens aren't particularly clever, but they were able to pool their resources and use their might to achieve global dominance. The fact that Africans live under colonial regimes does not matter. They can liberate themselves and advance the continent, just as America and India did. Religion. The second misconception is religion. There is a saying that when missionaries arrived in Africa, they brought the Bible, while Africans owned their lands and resources. The missionaries told the Africans to close their eyes to pray. And by the time the Africans finished praying, the missionaries owned the land and resources, while Africans had the Bible. Europeans introduced Christianity to Africans, and yet the Europeans are less Christians than the Africans. In Africa, a lot of people pray and think their prayers will cause food to come down from heaven. They believe God will return in the same manner as He did in the Old Testament, based on the religion they practice. They won't have to strive, because God will take care of everything for them. They will receive wealth from above. Many Pentecostal congregations still sing this same song today, misleading their members and leading other people astray. Africans can be saved if they embrace the Protestant work ethics. They should not expect to receive things for free. Instead, they must take responsibility for their own needs and not wait for God to provide for them. Religion and magic are similar. They cannot lead to meaningful development in Africa. Take a look at Benin, for instance, where voodoo and magic are practiced. They have not advanced. Also take a look at Haiti. The country has still not developed. However, it is the nation that pioneered the use of voodoo in the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, Africa will be able to develop if they can eliminate this mental mistake. Tribalism, nepotism, and clan. Most Africans think that belonging to their clans is a prerequisite for success. They owe loyalty to their tribes and clans. Africans cannot aspire to nationhood because they believe in the sacredness of their tribes or clans, And if they concentrate solely on their tribes and not their country, the country will continue to suffer. It's highly restrictive to limit your actions to what your clan will allow you to do. Africans can set themselves up for success if they can handle these three areas. Signs of hope and future challenges. Despite the challenges, Africa has shown signs of progress in recent decades. By the 1980s, political stability began to improve, and African countries started focusing on education and healthcare. Life expectancy increased and more children attended school. These improvements laid the foundation for future economic growth. In the 21st century, African countries are looking to East Asia as a model for development. By adopting policies that promote industry and entrepreneurship, Africa is beginning to experience economic growth. For example, African scientists have developed innovative solutions to local problems, such as turning invasive plants into animal feed. These developments are helping to create a growing mid-class with increased spending power, which in turn fuels domestic industries. Africa still faces significant challenges, including the impacts of climate change, ongoing corruption, and political instability. However, the continent is also home to a new generation of educated and skilled individuals who are working to build a better future. By focusing on homegrown solutions and fostering regional cooperation, African countries have the potential to break the cycle of poverty and achieve sustained economic growth. For instance, Africa's adaptation of East Asian economic policies has led to the establishment of factories, tech centers, and agricultural hubs across the continent. Additionally, Africa's same time zone alignment with Europe allows it to attract administrative jobs from European companies, boosting employment opportunities. African countries are also increasingly cooperating through organizations like the African Union and regional blocs, which aim to reduce trade barriers and strengthen political stability across the continent. These efforts are beginning to bear fruit, with some African nations now among the fastest growing economies in the world. To wrap up this video, Africa's road to prosperity is fraught with challenges, but the continent has immense potential. With continued focus on education, entrepreneurship, and regional cooperation, Africa can break free from the historical forces that have held it back. By harnessing the talents of its people and building on its rich resources, Africa can create a brighter future for its citizens. The lessons of history have shown that with the right institutions, leadership, and policies, Africa can overcome its challenges and build a prosperous future. As Africa continues to grow, it is poised to become an economic success story, much like other regions that were once mired in poverty but eventually found their way to prosperity. The future of Africa lies in the hands of its people, and with the right strategies, they can turn their potential into reality. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to Borderlink Reporters TV for more insightful content. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover the rich and diverse stories of this remarkable continent. Thank you for watching and stay blessed. Peace.